The smell of dust and pine always carried me back to childhood, and that was exactly what I breathed in when I first stepped onto the land my uncle had left me. 10 acres of freedom, a battered red barn that leaned against the weight of years, and a fence line that had seen better days. It was not perfect, but it was mine. After 2 decades in the Army moving from one deployment to another, I finally had a place where no one shouted in my ear, no orders barked across barracks, no alarms ripping me awake in the middle of the night. Just morning sun on the field, goats grazing free, and the rustle of dry grass across open sky. I had dreamed of this for years. The plan was simple. Fix the barns, patch the fences, and raise goats for soap and cheese. Maybe even run a little farmer's stand in town someday. Nothing loud and nothing flashy. Just work that tasted of earth and smelled of clean air. For a while it felt like the dream was right there on the horizon waiting for my hands to grab hold. But peace has a way of slipping out of grasp when other people cannot stand to see it. On the second week of moving in, I heard the crunch of polished shoes on my gravel drive and saw a woman approach with a stiff smile that looked like it had been frozen onto her face long before she walked up. Her hair sprayed stiff as lacquer, linen blouse tucked neat into pressed pants, manicured nails gripping a wicker basket filled with muffins that looked as dry as desert sand. She introduced herself as the president of the neighboring HOA, Cypress Heights, and said her name was Karen Whitmore with a kind of satisfaction as if reciting royal lineage. Her welcome basket came with fine print tucked inside between tissue paper. Cream-colored cardstock I would later learn was HOA stationery. Neatly printed rules about lawn upkeep, fence design, and outdoor decor. She handed it to me with the same expression you might use to hand someone their sentence. My goats were grazing near the barn at the time. She wrinkled her nose when she noticed them as if she had been forced to stand downwind of a sewage plant. She said they looked unsanitary. She glanced at the barn and sniffed that it was an eyesore. Then she added coldly that if I insisted on keeping the goats, I should at least install a privacy hedge so her community would not have to endure the sight of my unpainted house. I said nothing for a long while, just looked at her, at the basket turning stale in her hands, at the way her jaw tensed when silence stretched between us. Then I thanked her, turned back to my goats, and carried her basket inside where I dropped it straight into the trash. I assumed that would be the end of it. That kind of person usually only came around once to establish dominance before retreating back to manicured lawns and community newsletters. For a week it was quiet enough that I began to hope Karen had moved on. But entitlement of that magnitude does not fade. It festers. It started with small complaints. A noise report filed with animal control because my rooster crowed at dawn. The officer arrived embarrassed, apologizing while petting my rooster and making a note that no violation had occurred. Then came the accusation that my goats were wandering into her yards. When I checked the fences, I saw fresh damage and realized her grandchildren had likely left a gate unlatched. My goats had no interest in wandering into sterile flower beds. Still, I received another laminated violation notice declaring me responsible. Every week arrived with new drama. Alleged odor complaints from my compost pile. A letter about unregulated barn paint. Even a knock on the door from county authorities who looked just as annoyed as me when they realized Karen had lodged another false claim about sanitation issues. Each attempt failed, but every failure only hardened her. I began documenting everything. Each notice I received went into a file. Each conversation was logged. My years in uniform had taught me the value of patience and of evidence. You do not charge down a line without knowing the landscape, and Karen was now a battlefield I had to map carefully. About this time, my neighbor Dan started visiting. His property bordered the opposite side of the HOA, and he knew their ways. He was a wiry man with graying hair under a battered cap and carried himself with that casual ease that comes only from having already lost things you cared about. Dan had once been on the Cypress Heights board before Karen rallied her loyalists to push him out over what he later called the pickleball fiasco. He hated her brand of overreach, and he warned me she would not stop until she had tried to claim something that was not hers. I wanted to believe he was exaggerating. Surely the line was clear. My property was not signed into any HOA. The barbed fence my uncle built decades ago ran straight and true, staked with markers still recognized on county maps. What claim could she possibly make? But then small things started happening that made Dan's words ring less like paranoia and more like prophecy. One morning I found neon survey flags planted across the far end of my pasture. Another day a property marker had been shifted almost 10 feet inward. I replaced it, checked my security cameras, and discovered a hooded figure working nervously in the dark. No face visible, but the gesture of entitlement loud and clear. The next time Karen appeared, marching up in her oversized sunglasses with another printed sheet in hand, I confronted her about it. She looked genuinely offended at the suggestion that anyone from the HOA could have moved property markers. She tilted her head in mock confusion and suggested maybe I was mistaken. Maybe the marker was always there. It was the smile of someone already rehearsing their lies. For me, that moment was the spark. The muffled confirmation that Dan had been right. She was probing, testing, waiting for me to falter so she could pounce. This was no longer about goats or rooster noise. This was about territory. It was about slowly pushing until their subdivision spilled into my field. From that day forward I stepped up my preparation. I added new cameras with higher angles, reinforced the old gate with steel links, installed motion detectors along the foliage where the fences were weaker. The Army had taught me that waiting does not mean surrender. It means watching long enough for your enemy to expose themselves. Karen had yet to realize that while she thrived on petty harassment and cheap flyers, I thrived on endurance. I did not need to win every small skirmish. I only needed her to go far enough that her entire empire of fabrications would collapse on her head. So I played the waiting game, tended my goats, fixed my roof, harvested compost, and all the while watched Karen shuffle more papers, mail more complaints, and stomp across subdivision lawns convinced she was untouchable. She had no clue that in the shadows of my barn and hidden in tall grass along the fence line her downfall was already being recorded frame by frame. It was only a matter of time before she made the mistake I had been waiting for. The weeks after my first encounters with Karen proved one thing without question. She was not the kind of storm that passes overhead and drifts away. She was the kind that circles over the ridge waiting for the chance to strike again. And strike she did, not with a single blow but with an endless series of petty little assaults that drained patience like water leaking from a cracked bucket. It began with laminated paper. Every Monday without fail, a new sheet fluttered from my mailbox, my gate, or even pinned to the barn door. Each one carried a list of fabricated community violations, written in the tone of a frustrated teacher scolding an unruly child. Most of them were absurd. Excessive noise from equipment never used in the early hours. Failure to align barn paint with community visual standards. Grass height violations on land where sagebrush and mesquite grew wild. Every page looked official with a mock HOA logo and bright lettering, but none had legal weight. At first, I tossed them into a drawer, determined not to show that they rattled me. But I also filed away copies. My years in uniform had taught me the importance of evidence, the necessity of turning enemy carelessness into your armor. If Karen wanted to wage war through paper, I was going to build my arsenal out of her own handouts. Animal control came twice more that month. Each time, an officer appeared apologetic and slightly amused when my goats greeted them with bright eyes and docile temperaments. One officer admitted under his breath that he suspected his time was being wasted on purpose. Still, protocol required each check, and each time he marked that no violations existed. My animals were healthy, contained, and better behaved than most suburban dogs. County inspectors came once as well, sent after an anonymous complaint alleging that my barn paint created glare hazardous to the nearby subdivision's windows. When the inspector arrived, he laughed openly at the claim. My barn roof was faded red tin, rusted along the edges. Whatever shine it once had was long gone. He wrote up a clean report and shook my hand before leaving. Another complaint defeated. But Karen never let go. Each failure only built more determination in her eyes. Every time she arrived at my gate holding laminated sheets, her jaw seemed tighter, her breathing heavier, her voice more forced as if convinced that volume could manufacture authority. I kept my patience on the surface, though under the skin fire built. I knew she wanted me to explode. She wanted me to hurl curses or push her from the property line so she could play the victim. That was her trap, and I would not walk into it. So I stood calm, arms folded, face steady. Each time she handed me papers or waved at my goats in disgust, I told her firmly that none of her policies applied. She would leave growling behind her sunglasses, and I would add another paper to my folder. It became clear her harassment had moved beyond individual complaint. She had rallied support within the HOA board. I could see them gathering in her yard with clipboards, whispering near the fence line, pacing the border with tape measures as if plotting a takeover. What once had been single-woman noise now sounded like a coordinated campaign. That was when Dan pulled me aside over lemonade one late afternoon. His cap was pulled low against the sun, and his chair creaked as he leaned back with a sigh. He told me that HOA boards ruled not through law but through pressure. They relied on the ignorance of their residents, making people believe rules stretched farther than they really did. He suspected Karen and her allies intended to absorb my land by intimidation. He said tampering with property lines had been done before. He warned that the survey flags I had pulled were not harmless. They were tests. I believed him. Each morning after that, I checked every corner of my fence line. I found 2 markers moved again, this time placed deliberately in areas that, if left unchallenged, would give them space to claim boundary confusion. I corrected them, documented them, and logged entry after entry into my growing record. Laminated flyers grew thicker. One accused my goats of excessive noise, quoting decibel levels as if someone had stood in the pasture with a sound meter. Another claimed my compost pile created vermin risk despite the fully enclosed bin I had built. One particularly absurd notice referenced a safety risk due to unapproved outdoor furniture, by which they meant the folding chair I drank my coffee from each morning. The harassment was exhausting, but it was also predictable. And predictability was something I could use. I invested in more preparation. Security cameras lined the pastures now, tucked beneath oak branches and hidden in old wooden posts. Motion sensors beeped softly whenever something crossed into my land. I even mounted a camera high on the barn roof directed toward the subdivision, not for intimidation, but to ensure that no one could manipulate the fence or gates unseen. My land had become fortified not with weapons but with eyes, each one watching silently, storing truth for the moment it would be needed. What Karen failed to realize was that she was no longer testing me. She was building my case. The final straw of that month came on an afternoon heavy with heat. I returned from the feed store to find a group of strangers walking across my property, stepping over my grass with clipboards and cameras. A woman explained they were decorators measuring for an event. She said the HOA had offered them a private field for a wedding and pointed toward my pasture. My patience snapped into laughter so sharp even she looked startled. I explained that the field she pointed to was mine and that no HOA had any right to it. She looked shaken and hurried away, clearly understanding she had been misled. Later that evening, I saw Karen near the border fence gesturing wildly at board members, clearly furious the decorator had spoken to me. Her voice carried across the still air, sharp with agitation, though the words blurred into distance. I knew then Dan's warnings were correct. This was not just petty harassment. It had become coordinated. They were testing boundaries not to annoy me but to prepare for something larger. I replayed footage from my cameras that night, checking markers and fence posts carefully. Hooded shapes moving in the dark. Survey tape strung briefly then collected. Karen herself caught pointing at my land during one evening walk with her cronies. They were probing weak points. So I hardened my routine. Each morning I checked every lock, every chain. Each night I set my dog to guard the yard and verified the cameras hummed softly under their red light. My patience never broke in front of them. I knew their plan relied on pushing me far enough to create leverage. Instead of giving them what they wanted, I let their actions pile into a file so thick it began to look like a brick. On the surface, Karen looked triumphant, armed with flyers and cronies. But beneath the calm of my porch, I was already far ahead. Because I understood what she did not. War is not won through noise. It is won through patience. Through allowing an enemy to reveal themselves until they are exposed past repair. And Karen, blinded by her need to dominate, was already overreaching. One day she would cross the line that separated petty games from legal proof. When that day arrived, I would not need to shout. I would not need to threaten. I would let the evidence speak, and it would drown her louder than any megaphone ever could. By the time a month had passed since Karen first set her sights on my land, the petty attacks no longer felt random. Each flyer, each notice, each false complaint was building toward something larger. The rhythm of it told me there was a plan, even if I could not see the full shape. Yet every week another small violation was taped to my fence line. Every week property markers were shifted a few feet like pawns on a chessboard, and every week I reminded myself to stay calm, gather evidence, and wait for the moment they crossed the line beyond denial. That moment came sooner than I expected. One humid afternoon, Dan arrived at my porch with the grin of a man who had stumbled across buried treasure. He carried with him a folded printout, shaking it in his hand like a winning lottery ticket. He told me someone on the HOA board had mistakenly copied him on an internal email thread because they forgot he had been removed from his position years ago. He sat down and spread the sheet across my table. I read slowly and felt my pulse steady, just like it used to in the Army whenever a mission crystallized out of the fog. The email was from Karen. It detailed planning for what she called the Cypress Heights Spring Spectacle, a community gala expected to bring in vendors, decorators, photographers, and press. She described a vision of white tents glowing against rolling pastures, with guests arriving in formal dress and music playing under an open sky. In flowery detail, she wrote how the wedding proposed by her daughter would elevate the neighborhood's reputation and put Cypress Heights on the regional map. The word spring spectacle sounded harmless until I reached the phrase approved open field on the eastern border adjacent to HOA and cleared for temporary use. My stomach turned because that phrase did not describe some communal lawn. It described my land, the field beyond my barn, the very pasture where my goats grazed and where my property markers were being tampered with. I reread it twice, letting the realization settle heavy in my chest. This was no accident. They were planning to host their crowning event on my land, as if it were theirs. Karen had already told people it was secured. She had given decorators and planners the impression that Cypress Heights owned it. Dan leaned back in his chair, watching me process. The lines of amusement around his eyes hardened into seriousness. He said what I already knew: they were probing and planting because they had no intention of asking permission. They wanted to claim my pasture as common HOA property disguised under paperwork and plausible deniability. For a moment anger surged sharper than any complaint before, but then training took over, years of measured combat thinking, years of having to act with patience rather than rage. I slowed my breathing, drank from my glass of water, and considered carefully. A confrontation now would only give Karen time to pivot. Blame. A confrontation later, while her entire board and guests paraded across my stolen land, would trap her in her own arrogance. So I made a decision. I would not stop them from building. I would not call county authorities early. I would let them walk directly into their own downfall. The next few days confirmed I was right. Strange vehicles appeared along the border, people in jeans and polos measuring distances, taking photos with tablets, talking loud enough for me to catch fragments about staging rigs and parking space. I walked over to one young woman, asking what they were measuring. She smiled, saying she was with a wedding company hired for the HOA gala. I asked where exactly the field was. She pointed straight at my pasture. I laughed, told her plainly this was my property and that Karen had no authority here. She went pale, muttered something about checking again, and scrambled into her car. But by the next day the trucks returned. When I checked my cameras, I saw them carrying folding chairs, flower stands, and lighting equipment across my field. They had bypassed my driveway entirely, cutting loose part of the fencing at the far western line. The arrogance was staggering. They thought they could hide their trespass by avoiding my cameras, forgetting I had installed more than anyone could suspect. Their vehicles left tire tracks on my soil, and footprints crisscrossed the pasture. I could have called the sheriff then and there, but I kept silent. Instead, I noted the details: time of arrival, license plates, amount of equipment placed, every fact logged, and photographed. My file thickened by the day. The deeper they dug, the sharper the knife I would twist with truth. Dan and I spoke often through that week. He shook his head, amused at the sheer scale of Karen's ambition. He told me boards thrive on spectacle. The bigger the event, the stronger their illusion of power, and Karen wanted nothing less than spectacle. She wanted prestige, magazine coverage, and bragging rights that hunger would be her undoing. So I prepared silently. I repaired the gate, installed a heavier padlock, and made sure the barn doors were carefully secured. Then I stacked clean hay and oats inside, ensuring my goats would be energetic when I needed them. Dan chuckled when I told him my idea. He said a herd of goats might turn out to be the finest weapon against laminated flyers. We kept watch as the staging grew. Trucks rolled in, hauling tents, lighting rigs went up across my cedar trees. Strings of bulbs hung like stars misplaced across the sky. Not theirs. Florists trimmed bouquets by my trough. Musicians rehearsed under the shade of my oaks. It was surreal, standing 50 yards away, watching an entire wedding rise on stolen soil. Guests in polished shoes occasionally wandered the fence line, pointing cameras at the view. No one bothered to ask the owner because in their minds, their queen had already claimed it. From my porch I could see Karen marching around the tents in a satin gown giving instructions. Every movement of her hands screamed authority, every smile dripped entitlement. She looked like a monarch hosting her coronation in a palace she built on sand. But I stayed patient. A soldier waits for the moment when arrogance oversteps cover, and I knew this was far from their final act. Karen was building her masterpiece upon land she did not own. She would invite guests, she would welcome photographers, she would boast about Cypress Heights' finest hour, and then at the height of her triumph she would learn the cost of trespass. From that evening onward I sat in my flannel by the gate sipping tea while the sound of hammers echoed across the stolen pasture. My dog lay quiet beside me, watching the workers moving like ants in stolen fields, pretending they belonged, pretending their flags meant more than deeds. I had no need to shout or warn. For the first time I understood the beauty of patience. Karen had crossed into strategy, but so had I. She thought staging lights could erase fence lines, she thought satin dresses could cover up theft, but when the day came and her gala unfolded, I was going to show her that land built on false power collapses not with violence but with undeniable truth, and that truth was already in my files, my cameras, my locked gate, and in the restless hooves of 27 goats. Waiting in the barn. The morning of the wedding felt unreal from the very first moment I stepped outside. The sun rose golden through a thin veil of clouds, casting a soft glow over land that no longer looked like mine. The field was covered in tents, rows of white folding chairs, floral arches, and caterer tables balanced on planks driven into soil my uncle had worked with his bare hands decades ago. My barn had been surrounded by decorative lanterns that swung gently in the breeze. Photographers moved freely through the pasture, snapping shots of prearranged centerpieces. It looked like I had stumbled into some glossy lifestyle magazine spread built directly over my ownership. Karen floated through all of it like royalty touring her court. Satin gown glimmering with sequins, hair pulled so tightly back it shone against the sun, clipboard carried like a gold scepter tucked into her arm. She pointed here, barked orders there, waved at rental trucks, and smiled broadly when bridesmaids squealed about how perfect everything looked. To everyone else it appeared to be her land, her power, her showcase of authority. But to me it was arrogance building toward collapse. Dan sat under the oak tree by my porch with a pair of binoculars and a cooler of beer. He laughed each time another guest arrived in limousines or Ubers dragging long dresses and polished shoes into pasture dirt. He sipped slowly, already imagining the chaos to come. He asked if I was sure this would work. I told him I had no doubt. The evidence had been recorded. The lies had been stacked high. And the goats were ready. I walked the gate quietly that morning, checking the chain and padlock one last time. Secure. Solid. No escape without my consent. Across the field rows of chairs filled with guests. The string quartet warmed up softly under the arch of flowers. The air hummed with polite conversation and the heavy smell of perfume striking against the sweat of summer. In the barn behind me the goats shuffled impatiently. 27 of them pressed against the stalls, sniffing the air, eager and restless. I had stocked their hay and oats, given them water, and waited until the moment their curiosity would spill over like a flood held behind dam gates. Timing mattered. It needed to happen when every eye was fixed forward, when no denial could cover the trespass of this event. When the officiant raised his arms calling for guests to take their seats, a hush fell across the field. Karen stood with radiant pride in front of the arch, hand on her daughter's shoulder as the bride prepared to step into the aisle. Photographers crouched for the perfect shot. The string quartet struck a gentle melody and the crowd leaned forward smiling. That was when I walked to the barn, tugged the new latch, and swung the doors wide. The herd streamed out in a rush of bleeding hooves and flaring energy like they had been waiting their whole lives for this performance. They broke across the field, charging toward the nearest scent of food and flowers. Two veered instantly toward the decorated cake table, leaping together in a joyous assault. One goat leapt clean onto the three-tiered cake, toppling it in a cascading avalanche of sugar and icing. Another rammed its horns into the base of the DJ booth, sending wires and lights scattering. A gasp rose from the crowd, followed by shrieks of disbelief. Guests lifted dresses and tried to run as goats thundered through the aisles, scattering chairs like twigs. Flower girls screamed as goats chewed their baskets. The bride froze mid-step, her veil snatched clean away by one mischievous goat who galloped down the aisle, dragging it like a battle flag. The music ended in a screech as strings snapped and players fled. The DJ cursed loudly when one goat urinated against his power strip, sending sparks fizzing across the grass. Champagne toppled, Soufflés collapsed, and one elderly guest chasing a goat tripped over the buffet table, scattering appetizers into the mud. Karen shrieked louder than all of them. She screamed orders at guests like a drowning captain demanding discipline as her ship broke apart. Her satin gown flared in the stampede. Mascara streaked in black rivers from her eyes as she tried swatting a goat away from her corsage. The once pristine queen of the spectacle sank into a mess of animal chaos. I strolled to the front gate, leaning casually against the chain, sipping iced tea from a tall glass. Dan laughed from his chair, recording each moment through his phone like a war correspondent capturing victory for history. My calm posture contrasted perfectly against the storm inside the pasture. Guests rushed the gate banging and shouting to be released, but the padlock held steady. I told myself I would unlock it once the picture was clear enough, once the trespass became undeniable in every eye. There was no malice in me, only justice served plain by the arrogance of those who thought paper rules outweighed deeds. The bride sobbed as goats climbed over toppled chairs, her white gown smudged brown and green. The groom shouted desperately, trying to push goats aside, only to have one ram his leg, sending him toppling onto his back. Caterers abandoned their trays, running for the parking area, while a groomsman attempted to lasso a goat with his tie, only to be dragged across the grass to roars of laughter from surrounding neighbors who had gathered beyond the fence to enjoy the spectacle. Karen's shriek pierced again as a goat latched onto the hem of her gown, chewing industriously. Guests snapped photos with phones, catching the HOA president mid-battle against livestock in a satin war zone. The image would travel faster than any flyer she had ever taped to my fence. The police eventually arrived, guided by calls flooding dispatch from panicked guests. Cars rolled down the dusty drive, lights flashing though sirens stayed silent. Stepping out, deputies surveyed the chaos in disbelief. Goats wandering across tables, chairs snapped in heaps, guests furious, sweaty, and humiliated. They found me calm at the gate, hands folded, deed tucked under my arm. I showed them recordings from my cameras, proof of the back fence section removed, proof of trucks driving across my soil, proof of staging equipment planted without consent. Guests muttered behind them. Karen cried out, "Liar, liar," but her voice carried no weight. Frosting streaked her once regal outfit, goat stains dragged across satin, no respect left from her crowd. The deputies nodded, reviewed the documents, and turned to her stern. They informed her and the entire crowd that what had happened was trespass, plain and simple. No permits, no permission, no contracts, a violation of law on top of arrogance. They told her the land was mine and the authority was mine. She collapsed to the ground in fury, sobbing that it was supposed to be perfect. The deputies issued a trespass order on the spot, forcing the crowd to leave the pasture. I unlocked the gate slowly, and the guests poured out, disgruntled, shoes ruined, dresses torn, hair disheveled as they shuffled by. Some glared, others muttered curses, but none had the will to defend her, not after the humiliation, not after the truth was laid bare. The herd of goats eventually wandered back to their barns, satisfied and unbothered, licking icing from their mouths. The field was left a wasteland of broken chairs, trampled flowers, and shattered pride. The mighty spectacle reduced to nothing but bleeding hooves and the bitter silence of defeat. Dan clinked his beer against mine as the sun set across the horizon. Both of us quiet except for laughter that bubbled every so often from replaying the absurdity in our minds. Never in all my years had I seen justice so poetic, so perfectly timed. I had not raised my voice, I had not lifted a hand. All I had done was open a barn door and wait. The land had defended itself through the hooves of goats, patient for their moment of freedom. And Karen, who had marched in satin, convinced her dominance stretched across boundaries she did not own, now left with torn dress, ruined reputation, and humiliating proof that her reign of intimidation ended in chaos. This was not the end. I knew her pride would not allow surrender. She would seek retaliation with lawyers, complaints, and threats. But as I watched the ruined gala scatter down the road in shame, I felt the balance tilt in my favor. Evidence stacked high, community opinion shifting, and reputation crumbling around her feet. The war was far from over, but the first great battle had been won. Not with weapons, but with goats and patience. The pasture still carried the scars from the storm when morning arrived. Folding chairs lay snapped in half, flowers crushed into the dirt, frosting smeared like paint across trampled grass. The field smelled of hay, sweat, perfume, and goat musk blended into a pungent reminder that arrogance had consequences. My barn stood tall at the edge, goats settled calmly once again, chewing hay as if they had not just toppled a queen from her throne the day before. I sat on the porch with coffee in hand, watching sun climb slowly over the ridge. Dan joined me, leaning on the railing, laughter still shaking off his chest whenever he replayed the chaos in his mind. He reminded me that what happened had not been luck. It had been strategy, patience honed through months of lies and harassment. The wedding had not been destroyed by goats alone, he said. It had been destroyed by greed, by Karen believing she could claim what was never hers. By midday, the first report appeared online. Some guest had uploaded shaky footage of a goat climbing onto the cake and Karen screaming as her gown was chewed to pieces. Within hours, the video had spread across social media. Memes exploded. Captions labeled her HOA queen dethroned by goats. One snapshot of her mascara running while she wrestled with a folding chair became a viral punchline across national feeds. I had not spoken a word to the press, but the evidence traveled without me. My cameras provided clean angles, Dan provided commentary, and the truth wrapped itself around the world's laughter. Soon local news showed up at the gate, then regional reporters. I refused interviews, telling each one quietly that my lawyer was handling everything. But each time I turned them down, clips of the footage still streamed across televisions exposing Karen in vivid humiliation. The backlash hit her fast. HOA members called emergency meetings trying to explain why association funds had been siphoned into flower arrangements, rental tents, and deposits for catering. I heard from Dan that she had used the HOA credit line to pay bills disguised under vague categories: community beautification, seasonal event planning. Her loyalists panicked. Neighbors began whispering that new assessments would be charged to cover losses. People who once defended her now kept their distance. What Karen could not stand most was not the laughter from strangers but the silence from those who had once bowed to her demands. One by one, her supporters drifted away, leaving her alone to carry blame. She doubled down anyway, accusing me of staging the sabotage as if I had somehow trained 27 goats to topple electronics and cake on cue. She sent letters signed by attorneys filled with accusations of emotional distress and public endangerment. I handed them all calmly to my lawyer, who smiled as he stacked them on his desk and told me each one only strengthened our counterclaims. The sheriff's office opened an investigation after I presented every piece of evidence. Photos of tire tracks through my fields. Video proof of workers removing sections of my fence. Screenshots of her emails promising a secured open field. The case was too strong to ignore. Trespassing charges were filed alongside property damage and misuse of HOA funds. Karen shrieked at cameras outside the meetings that she was the real victim. No one believed her anymore. Meanwhile, life shifted for me in ways I had not expected. The footage of the goat stampede gave me a new reputation in the county. At the feed store, people patted me on the back, calling me Goat Hero. At the market, families asked to take photos with the animals. It was light-hearted attention, not the kind I sought, but it signaled something deeper. Folks who had once eyed my land suspiciously now understood exactly where the line was drawn and who truly owned it. The HOA crumbled from inside. Board members resigned, afraid of lawsuits. Residents formed a committee to demand refunds for fees Karen had illegally redirected. My neighbor Dan passed me minutes from their latest meeting where members openly discussed removing her from leadership permanently. They feared liability, feared more press, feared the mountain of evidence growing larger every day. By late summer, the lawsuit filed by my attorney formally went to court. Catherine Whitmore and the Cypress Heights HOA faced claims of trespass, harassment, property destruction, defamation, and financial fraud tied to their unauthorized use of my land. Their defense sputtered weakly. Karen insisted she believed the pasture was community shared space. The judge asked for documentation. She had none. He asked for event permits. None again. He asked whether she ever received written lease or consent from me. She stared at the floor. The ruling handed down was blunt. Restitution for damages. Repayment of legal fees. Prohibition of Karen or the HOA from conducting events outside their lawful boundaries ever again. Warnings of further penalties if violations continued. Karen collapsed under the weight of the verdict, storming out with mascara streaked and jaw clenched as reporters crowded around her flinging questions. She shouted that justice had been stolen, that the system was corrupt, that the goats were weaponized against her. Hearing her try to twist reality into her favor one last time was almost amusing. The world had already moved on. As for me, I took the settlement and invested where it mattered. I rebuilt the barn stronger than ever with new stalls and fresh roofing. I restored fencing across every border with steel reinforcements, leaving no gap for anyone to sneak through again. And then I built something unexpected. A small weekend attraction called the Goat Yard. Families began visiting to pet goats, buy handmade soap, and take part in goat yoga on the weekends. Local teens worked part-time helping clean stalls and greet customers. Dan kept track of books and scheduling, proud to call himself director of goat affairs. We lived simply, nothing extravagant, but the laughter of visitors echoed across fields where once only complaints had carried. The animals that ruined Karen's reputation turned into ambassadors of peace. Months later, I received a letter in plain envelope. Inside, a slip of paper written in hurried hand. "Congratulations on your circus, enjoy the fleas." No signature needed. The bitterness bled from every line. I tucked it into a folder of old flyers and notices and closed the drawer. Some wounds never heal for people like her. But for me, it was closure. When autumn arrived, golden lights spilling across the hills, I hosted the first real wedding on my land. This time it was done with respect, permit signed, contract sealed, and payment fair. The couple wanted goats at the ceremony, not as intruders but as guests. One wore a wreath of flowers and walked calmly beside the bride. Children laughed, parents smiled, and not a single voice screamed about trespass. I leaned against the gate that evening watching sunset burn over the pasture and felt the peace I had envisioned the first day I moved here. Dan asked if I regretted not stopping Karen sooner. I told him no, because sometimes people dig their own graves deeper than any enemy ever could. All you need is patience and resolve to let truth expose lies. That was the lesson Karen taught not only me but the whole community. Now when I walk the fence line each evening, I no longer check nervously for flags or tampered markers. I carry confidence instead. My land is mine, clearly defined, secured by deeds and defended by patience. The goats graze steadily, leaving behind only the soft sound of hooves against grass. The ranch breathes blessed quiet at last. Karen fades in memory not as a threat but as a cautionary tale. The woman who thought rules written on laminated paper could outweigh truth carved into soil. The woman who believed she could take without asking and learned instead that arrogance eats itself alive. The scandal of the ruined wedding will live longer than she likes. Memes will float across the internet for years of her gown being dragged through mud or a goat leaping over the cake table. People will laugh. I will smile. Because for me, it is no longer about her. It is about what grows after storms settle. Patience, truth, peace, and 27 goats who once carried justice into a wedding and gave me back my land.